Hello, NSA. It is great to be back here, but I'm also a little sad because this is my fourth time here and my last time, so I hope that I have saved the best for last. In fact, I know I have because we're going to talk about John Milton. And there are only two kinds of people in the world. There are those who love John Milton, and then there are terrible human beings. So maybe you love Milton, maybe you don't, but I hope that I will give you a better appreciation of his poetry, specifically Paradise Lost, and how it fits within the theme that we have been talking about for the last academic year: Calvinism's impact on conceptions of beauty and ugliness during the Renaissance. So I've titled this presentation, Beauty Not Approached by Stronger Hate: Do Calvinist Aesthetics and the Puritan Reader in Paradise Lost. That subtitle is extremely controversial, and as the presentation goes on, you will figure out why if you don't know already. At a recent conference, I told a fellow Miltonist about my presentation, and I gave him the title, and he recoiled in horror. And so I will explain why he would have had that reaction as we get further into the material. But first, I want to start with a story that fascinates me. There we go. All right. So in 1972, on a Pentecost Sunday, a 33-year-old, long-haired, bearded expatriate from Hungary named Laszlo Toth entered St. Peter's Basilica on a mission. Toth quickly pushed through the crowds of tourists who had come to gawk at the Vatican and all its treasures, and he climbed over the railing that separated them from what is arguably the Vatican's most popular exhibit besides the Sistine Chapel, the statue of Michelangelo's Pieta, which depicts Mary holding the body of the crucified Christ. And so Toth climbed over the railing, and he produced a geologist's hammer, and then he began to strike the statue 15 times. And with each blow, he screamed, "I am Jesus Christ, risen from the dead." Now, thankfully, the horrified onlookers quickly took action. They overpowered Toth, they removed his hammer, but not before he had managed to do incredible damage to the statue. He severed the Virgin Mary's arm at the elbow, he chipped off her nose, and he did severe damage to her eye. Now, if you go to the Vatican today, you can see the restored Pieta, which is just as beautiful as ever, but it is still encased in glass to make sure that other would-be cultural terrorists are not able to desecrate this Renaissance masterpiece. Now, what fascinates me is we don't really know that much about Toth or why he did this. He never stood trial for his crimes. He was declared mentally insane and unable to stand trial. So he was put in a Rome mental institution for 2 years. And when he got out, he quickly returned to his home country and faded into obscurity. So we can only speculate about why he did this, what his motivation was, but it seems clear that he was convinced of his own divinity, and he saw Michelangelo's statue as a challenge to his Godhead, as a reminder that he was not, in fact, Jesus Christ risen from the dead. And so, confronted with the beauty of the statue and the theological message it presented, that he had to destroy it because you can't have two Jesus Christs in the same room. And so I'm fascinated by this assault on a work of art, but I'm also fascinated with how people in the Renaissance might have understood this. I'm fascinated how people in the Renaissance would have understood Toth's assault on the work of art. Over the course of the semester, we've talked about the Neoplatonists, and a key idea in Neoplatonism is the aesthetic ladder, that we begin by observing physical beauty, and then if we open ourselves up to it, if we think about it in a spirit of innocence and reason, it will draw us higher and higher towards the divine. So this is an idea that, of course, goes all the way back to Socrates, and it's key to how many Renaissance humanists think about beauty, that human beings are basically good, and so exposure to beauty makes us better. It draws us towards the divine. And to contemplate any physical work is eventually to be caught up in something greater than yourself. This is how many Neoplatonists understand beauty. And so for the Neoplatonists, a person like Laszlo Toth, his assault on the statue would be perplexing because he sees the beauty of the statue, and rather than be in awe of it, rather than be inspired by it, he's motivated to try to destroy it. So I think the Neoplatonists would have struggled to account for this kind of behavior because it can't simply be dismissed as just a failure to reason critically. What I'm also interested in is how Calvinists would have understood this assault on beauty. Now, it needs to be said that for Calvinists, many Calvinists, of course, were caught up in the iconoclastic movement in the Reformation. There are many people, probably John Calvin included, who would have sung cheers as to watch anybody destroy a statue of the Virgin Mary with a hammer. They probably would have loved that. But if you move past the political, ideological significance of statues, and we think about this cultural terrorism as an assault on beauty, I wonder how Calvin would have made sense of that. Because one of the ideas I've traced over the course of the semester is that for Calvin, we are not climbing the Platonic ladder. Human beings are not born basically good. We're born fallen, and therefore we are not inherently rational. Even when we reason correctly, we lack the will to choose what's good, what's true, and what's beautiful. And so for Calvin, rather than climbing the ladder, we're wandering the labyrinth. Now, Calvin, this is his favorite metaphor for the human condition. He describes the labyrinth as the state of fallen human beings before they're freed by the grace of God. And Calvin says, when he talks about beauty, that some people see beauty, they see this thing that's meant to draw their attention to God, and they just ignore it. It falls flat on them. They don't have the ears to hear it. They don't have the eyes to see it. And so when they encounter beauty, it just has no power for them. Calvin says some people see the divine, but they distort it, they pervert it, they turn it into an idol, and they worship the creation rather than the creator. But one of the things Calvin would have realized is that there are people like Laszlo Toth. There are people who look at beauty and they don't just ignore it, they don't corrupt it, they feel this drive to destroy it. Because beauty is a reminder that they are not God, they are not Jesus Christ risen from the dead, they are not these autonomous, self-contained individuals who make and determine their own reality. And so anything that challenges our threat to our power and autonomy has to be destroyed. And so what I want to talk with you today about is what I would call failed responses to beauty that are extreme. People like Laszlo Toth, who when confronted with beauty, feel the need to strike it with a hammer. A startling example of this, I think, comes from William Shakespeare's, let's see, there we go, The Measure for Measure. Who's read Measure for Measure out of curiosity? Anybody? Oh, not nearly enough of you. You guys need to go read Measure for Measure. It's a great play. It's very dark, very twisted, but since most of you haven't read it, let me give you the 60-second summary of it. This play is one of Shakespeare's darkest plays. It's the only play that has a title that's drawn directly from the Bible, and it is about a duke in the city of Vienna who decides that he's going to go on a trip, and so he takes his right-hand man, his advisor Angelo, very specifically chosen name, I think, and he puts Angelo in his position of power. He makes him the governor, and says, it's your responsibility to enforce the laws. And so Angelo is going to enforce a law that will lead to the execution of this young man, and his sister, Isabella, who's a nun, comes to try to save him. And so she comes to Angelo's court, and so she pleads with him to try to intervene and to try to save her brother's life. And while Isabella is giving this passionate speech for mercy and calling for Angelo to show mercy to save her brother, Angelo, who is this cold-hearted, ruthless, or not ruthless, that's the wrong term. He's just a cold-hearted man who has no compassion whatsoever. Everything is by the book. Everything is, done according to the letter of the law. He suddenly feels this passion swelling up inside him. But it's not a spirit of mercy, it's a spirit of lust. And he feels this incredible passion to have sex with Isabella. And so he makes her a horrific offer. He says, if you will sleep with me, I will spare your brother's life. And this puts Isabella in this dilemma that guides the rest of the play. And so here I have this speech when Isabella leaves the courtroom. Angelo, who has always thought of himself as this virtuous, upright man, is trying to figure out why he suddenly is overwhelmed by these impure desires. So let me read his speech there, because this will be relevant to these kind of extreme failed responses to beauty that we're talking about here today. Angelo says, "What's this? What's this? Is this her fault or mine? The tempter or the tempted? Who sins most? Ha! Not she, nor does she tempt, but it is I that lying by the violet in the sun do as the carrion does, not as the flower, corrupt with virtuous season. Can it be that modesty may more betray our sense than woman's lightness? Having waste ground enough, shall we desire to raise the sanctuary and pitch our evils there? O fie, fie, fie! What doest thou, or what art thou, Angelo? Dost thou desire her folly for those things that make her good?" And so what Angelo is realizing here is that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who are like violets, and there are people like carrion, which is an early modern term for basically roadkill. And so if you are a violet, you're the kind of person who, when you are put in the presence of goodness, beauty, you grow closer to it. You become more like it. This is what the Neoplatonic ladder imagines most human beings are like. But then there are people who are carrion. There are people who are rotten and depraved. And so in the same way that if you expose a piece of rotten meat to the sun, it will breed maggots, it will rot. Angelo realizes there are some people who, when they're placed in the presence of beauty, don't get better, they get worse. Now, what's astounding here, and this is the thing that would challenge a Neoplatonist, is that Angelo reasons correctly about his failed response to Isabella's beauty. He realizes that this reveals his sin. He realizes that he's the one at fault for having this lust for her. She's not the one tempting him. He correctly identifies his own moral failure. He also correctly perceives her beauty and her virtue, but he still experiences this desire to corrupt her, and he becomes worse as a result of his, what we could call his aesthetic experience. He doesn't become better. And so here in Measure for Measure, we have Shakespeare describing an extreme failed response to beauty, someone wandering Calvin's labyrinth who doesn't find their way out of it. And so this is the kind of thing that we see in a lot of Renaissance literature, these extreme responses to beauty. Now, what I've been wondering about in preparation for this talk are these extreme failed responses to beauty, people like Angelo, people like Laszlo Toth, and of course I know how John Calvin would make sense of them, but I'm wondering is how John Milton would have made sense of these, because I believe that John Milton and John Calvin have a great deal in common. I think they share a very common theological vision of the world. That argument, however, is very, very controversial. So throughout the last 50, 60 years in Milton studies, there's been an assumption that John Milton is most definitely not a Calvinist. He is adamantly opposed to Calvinist theology. Now, this assumption is really interesting in terms of how it developed. So if you look at most of Milton's works, Milton was one of the most prolific writers in English literature. He wrote a number of political polemics during the English Civil War. Milton is one of those writers where we know what he thought about virtually everything and anything, including wrestling, by the way. I was going back through some of my notes on Milton. Milton thought we needed more wrestling classes in college, which I find hilarious. He's like, we produced intellectually strong but physically weak men, and we need more wrestling classes. So we know that he thought that. Milton wrote extensively about anything and everything that came into his mind. And so during the 1640s, 1650s, all of Milton's works are very Calvinist. They are consistent with the theology of the Puritans at this time period that he was politically and theologically aligned with. Then something interesting happens, though, in Milton's studies. So in 1823, long after Milton has died, people were going through some political papers, and they found a Latin manuscript called De Doctrina Christiana. This is right here. It's written in the hand of Milton's secretary. Milton went blind, and so most of his correspondence was written by his secretary. And this is basically a theological treatise. It's a systematic theology in which the writer attempts to basically go through every aspect of Christian thought and articulate a clear defense of quote-unquote biblical theology. The problem is De Doctrina Christiana is most definitely not biblical. There are many sections of De Doctrina that are straight up heretical. One of the sections, among other things, rejects the doctrine of the Trinity. So the discovery of this manuscript radically changed Milton's studies. And so what people assume throughout Milton's scholars is that at some point Milton rejected the Calvinism of his youth, and he embraced a increasingly heterodox theology that eventually became straight up heretical. And so if you go through Milton's scholarship, you will find statements like this. This is from Harold Bloom. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Harold Bloom says, "We must never forget that Milton was a Christian heretic rather than a Calvinist." I like that Harold Bloom assumes that the opposite of Calvinism is heresy. Catherine Gemelli Martin says, "Because Paradise Lost could not have been written by a conventional Calvinist, it is hard to suppose that if Richard Baxter or John Bunyan ever read the epic, they would not have been keenly aware that it attacks the central Calvinist mysteries." Nigel Smith says it very simply, "Paradise Lost is a heresy machine." And this is a commonplace in Milton studies. Most people assume because of De Doctrina Christiana, it's attributed to Milton, it's assumed that he wrote it at some point later in life, that this is a reflection of his his mature theology, and so we should read it then back into his literary works. And this idea has had a huge implication for Milton's studies, specifically studies of Paradise Lost. So what I'm going to argue to you guys today is that John Milton is actually a Calvinist. I believe that there is no conflict between Milton and Calvin's theology. I think De Doctrina is a very problematic document. I don't think it's been fully ascertained that Milton wrote it, but even if we do go with the conclusion that he wrote it, that nevertheless does not prevent us from reading Calvinist elements in Milton's theology. So many parts of De Doctrina Christiana are heretical, some are Arminian, especially the writer's discussion of fate and free will. He's very Arminian when he thinks about that. He has a very libertarian view of human freedom. But what no Milton scholar to date has ever really considered is that one section of Paradise Lost where the writer, De Doctrina Christiana, where the writer talks about sin is very, very Calvinist. Essentially, the writer reaffirms total depravity. Now, I don't know how you try to blend Arminian free will and total depravity, but whoever wrote De Doctrina Christiana certainly did. So in one section, you will find this Arminian defense of free will, and in the section on human nature and sin's effects on human nature, you'll essentially find a Calvinist view of the fallen condition, or fallen human condition. There's only one scholar, William Poole, that I'm aware of who has noted this, but he even soft pedals it. He argues that the writer is more soft in his view of sin than John Calvin. So I wanted to challenge that idea by sharing some quotes from John Calvin's Institute on total depravity and sin and looking at them side by side with words from De Doctrina Christiana. So here we have Calvin on one side, Milton on the other side. So Calvin, when asked about sin's effects on human nature, says, after the heavenly image in man was effaced, he, meaning Adam, not only was himself punished, but he involved his posterity also and plunged them in the same wretchedness. The sin of the first man passed to all his posterity. All of us, therefore, descending from an impure seed, come into the world tainted with the contagion of sin. This is what Milton, or at least the writer of De Doctrina Christiana, says. Thus, as soon as the fall occurred, our first parents became guilty, though there could have been no original sin in them. Moreover, all of Adam's descendants were included in this guilt, though original sin had not yet been implanted to them. Finally, guilt is taken away from the regenerate, but they still have original sin. So far, they sound very similar to one another. So in another section, when Calvin is talking about the sin's effects on human reason, how we perceive the world, how we judge the world, he and the writer of De Doctrina Christiana sound very similar to one another. So Calvin says, therefore, since reason by which man discerns between good and evil, and by which he understands and judges, is a natural gift, it could not be entirely destroyed, but being partly weakened and partly corrupted, a shapeless ruin is all that remains. Man suffers, Milton says, the loss, or at least the extensive darkening of that right reason, whose function it was to discern the chief good, and which it were the life of understanding. So these kinds of quotes continue throughout De Doctrina Christiana. There's this remarkable similarity. So when Calvin is talking about the image of God and what it means to possess the image of God in our fallen state, he says, it cannot be doubted that when Adam lost his first estate, he became alienated from God. Wherefore, although we grant that the image of God was not utterly effaced and destroyed in him, it was, however, so corrupted that anything which remains is fearful deformity. And therefore, our deliverance begins with that renovation which we obtain from Christ, who restores us to true and substantial integrity. The writer of De Doctrina Christiana, on the other hand, says, original sin resulted in the lessening of the majesty of human countenance and the degradation of the mind. However, it cannot be denied that some traces of the divine image still remain in us, which are not wholly extinguished by death. So here we have, again, remarkable similarities between these two writers. And I think it's worth noting that Calvin's favorite metaphor for the human condition is the labyrinth. This is an idea he gets from Theseus, from his background as a classical humanist. He uses this 9 to 12 times, depending on which version of the Institutes you're reading. And it's interesting to me that Milton also uses this same metaphor or variations of it in Paradise Lost. So, for example, in Paradise Lost, when the fallen angels are trying to figure out what they can do in their fallen condition, how much freedom and power they have, this is how Milton describes it in Paradise Lost. He says, in thoughts more elevate, they reasoned high of providence, foreknowledge, will, and fate. fixed fate, free will, foreknowledge, absolute, and found no end in wandering mazes lost. So it seems that whenever the writer of De Doctrina Christiana or Milton as the writer of Paradise Lost talk about the human condition, they often talk about it in this highly Calvinistic language, right? We see this in Paradise Lost, book 3, where God and the Son are talking about what will happen to humanity after they fall, because of course God is all-knowing, he sees that the fall will happen, and he and the Son, Jesus Christ, determine what will happen to humanity. So pay attention to this top line right here, because this first line seems to me strikingly Arminian. He says, "Man shall not quite be lost, but saved who will." That sounds very much like a libertarian definition of human freedom. Salvation is based ultimately on our choice. But then God, the Father, changes, pulls the rug out from underneath us, and he switches to a definition of salvation that sounds very monergistic as opposed to synergistic. He says, "Yet not of will in him, but grace in me. Freely vouchsafe, once more I will renew his lapsed powers, though forfeit and enthralled by sin to foul exorbitant desires. Upheld by me, yet once more shall he stand on even ground against his mortal foe. By me upheld, that he may know how frail his fallen condition is, and to me owe all his deliverance, and to none but me." Now, if you were arguing for an Arminian interpretation of Paradise Lost, this might be where you would interject and say he's talking about the Arminian definition of prevenient grace, which is, as Arminians believe it, that human beings fell, but then God restored us out of our total depravity and basically kind of picked us back up, got us where we needed to be, so that now our freedom to choose or to reject Christ and his offer of salvation is restored to us. But notice the next line, okay? God, once again, kind of pulls the rug out from underneath that interpretation. He says, "Some I have chosen of peculiar grace, elect above the rest. So is my will, the rest shall hear me call, and oft be warned their sinful state, and to appease betimes the incensed deity, while offered grace invites. For I will clear their senses dark, what may suffice, and soften stony hearts to pray, repent, and bring obedience due." So once again, we have this Calvinist language of peculiar grace given to some but not others. This to me is completely consistent with a Calvinist reading of Paradise Lost and with the writer of De Doctrina Christiana, if that is Milton, with his understanding of sin and how it affects human nature. And let's look at one more passage here. We have this passage from Adam. Adam is fallen here. He's eaten the forbidden fruit, and he's wrestling with his own fallen condition and how it's corrupted his original nature that God gave him. So look at the language that he uses here. It's strikingly Calvinistic to me. Adam says, "But from me what can proceed but all corrupt, both mind and will depraved, not to do only, but to will the same with me. How can they then acquitted stand in sight of God? Him after all disputes forced I absolve, all my evasions vains and reasonings through mazes." Again, we get back to that Calvinist language of the labyrinth. "Leads me still but to my own conviction, first and last on me, only as the source and spring of all corruption. All the blame lights do, so might the wrath. Fond wish, couldst thou support that burden heavier than the earth to bear, than all the world much heavier, though divided with all that bad woman. Thus what thou desirest and what thou fearest alike destroys all hope of refuge, and concludes thee miserable beyond all past examples and future. To Satan only like both crime and doom. O conscience, into what abyss of fears and horrors hast thou driven me, out of which I find no way, from deep to deeper plunged." So once again, we have this strikingly Calvinist language. So this is the dilemma to me for reading Paradise Lost and trying to figure out how Miltonic theology relates to Miltonic poetry. Everything John Milton writes during the 1640s, the 1650s, before he writes Paradise Lost, is entirely consistent with Calvinism and Puritan theology. If he did write De Doctrina in later life and embrace some heretical beliefs, he still retained a very Calvinist view of human nature. And so what I'm arguing is that if we want to read Paradise Lost rightly, we have to understand Calvin's view of the fallen human condition and how it factors into Milton's theology and Milton's poetics here. So the question I'm going to ask to you guys is, can a Calvinist read Paradise Lost, right? And this question, for many scholars, according to Catherine Gemelli Martin, is the answer to this question is no. You can't read Milton's Poetics without being offended by his theology. And so this has just become a commonplace in Miltonic studies that Milton is so opposed to Calvinism, there's no way you can read these passages without finding your own personal Reformed theology challenged. I don't think that's the case. And so what I'm going to argue to you guys is that Calvinists can read Paradise Lost. They can read it and find support for their own theology because much of Milton's theology is consistent with Calvinism, at least when he talks about total depravity and its effects on human nature. We don't know if he wrote, or at least I'm not convinced he wrote De Doctrina Christiana, but I am convinced that if he did, then he retained this view of the Calvinist labyrinth. And so the question then is, if Milton believes in the reality of Calvin's labyrinth, how does that affect our experience reading this poem? How do the poetics relate to the theology? And so that's what I want to talk with you guys about as we go through this poem here. Now, one of the biggest challenges for reading Paradise Lost is that it requires you to think about Adam and Eve naked. I don't know if you guys have ever had that experience, but maybe you were kids, you had a little Sunday school Bible, and you had Adam and Eve very conveniently hidden by these gigantic hedges or bushes. And if you look at Renaissance art, most Renaissance art is comfortable depicting the nudity of Adam and Eve, but there's always a very conveniently placed fig leaf. As a kid, I just assumed that's what you did in Paradise. You walked around with a fig leaf, right? So I didn't know why, I just assumed you did, right? And so most Renaissance art acknowledges that we are fallen, and as fallen people, we have a propensity to lust. And so it tries to depict the reality of a pre-lapsarian world while making some sort of accommodation for our post-lapsarian condition. I always tell my students, one of the biggest challenges of reading Paradise Lost is it tasks you with this incredible burden. It tasks you with imagining a perfect world. But you can't do that because if Milton is right, you're a fallen person. If John Calvin is right, you're a fallen person. And even if the grace of God is at work in you, sanctifying you, you still have fallen impulses. You still have fallen tendencies that you struggle with. And so no matter how sanctified we are, human beings cannot conceive of a perfect environment without projecting something into our imagination that should not be there. And this is what I love to talk about with my students when we're describing our experience of reading the poem, how much of what we project or envision in Paradise Lost is a reflection of our fallen nature, and how much of it is what Milton intends, which is for us to imagine a perfect and complete world. And so if you're reading Paradise Lost, one of the things that I think is very challenging is that Milton asks you to think about the protagonists who spend the entirety, except for the last few lines of the poems, naked. They run around nude in Paradise Lost, and Milton constantly asks you to he constantly reminds you of that. In fact, when Milton asks you to imagine Adam and Eve's nudity, he always reminds you that their genitals are not covered. He describes their naked majesty, and then he says something along the lines here of, then were those mysterious parts not concealed, then was not guilty shame. He basically reminds you that they weren't wearing fig leaves like they are in this Renaissance painting because they didn't need it. That's a reflection of a post-lapsarian world. Now, I threw this out once in a secular grad school class, and I said, this must be very challenging for Christians because you constantly have to imagine Adam and Eve naked. And he's like, no, Renaissance art has all this nudity in it. That wouldn't have been a problem. But Milton has, as one critic put it, an unmitigated emphasis on Adam and Eve's nudity. He constantly imagines them naked. He constantly asks you to imagine them. He describes them having sex in paradise, and he asks you to imagine that. And so if you are a Christian and you take very seriously Jesus' commandment in Matthew, if it will come up here. Whoops. There we go. In Jesus' commandment in Matthew 5, that if you even imagine something that is not consistent with the biblical sexual ethic, that is a sin of lust, all right? So in light of Jesus' words in Matthew 5, it seems like what Paradise Lost is asking us to do is very, very dangerous because it's asking us to imagine Adam and Eve naked. It's asking us to imagine them having sex. And it's putting this tremendous burden on us as the reader to do what we can't do, which is to imagine something perfectly. And I think Milton knows this. I think he knows we cannot construct an image of paradise without corrupting it in some way. This is one of my favorite exercises to do in my class when I read Thomas More's Utopia. I have my students write out an imaginary society and describe an ideal world. And then I have them read their vision of an ideal world, and inevitably someone in the class will go, "That's horrible. I wouldn't want to live in that society." And they get into an argument about what an ideal world looks like. I think Paradise Lost essentially asks us to do something else, or something similar. It invites us to look at Adam and Eve, but to create an image of their mind that's free of sin. And this is a challenge for, I believe, a Puritan reader of Paradise Lost. So throughout the poem, what makes this challenge difficult is the reader's view is regularly aligned with Satan. Satan is this voyeur who enters paradise, and he's constantly spying on Adam and Eve. He's constantly watching them and looking at them, and the reader is always aligned with Satan's perspective. And so I like to describe it as Satan is peering at Adam and Eve through the bushes, and the reader is right behind him. We get to watch Satan watch Adam and Eve. And so whenever this happens, there's always a risk. The film critic Laura Mulvey is famous for introducing the concept of the gaze. And this is a film term, but I think it applies to poetry as well. A gaze is created when the camera looks at a character the way the audience is supposed to look at a character. And so in Paradise Lost, the gaze of Satan, the reader is tempted to imitate that and to look at Adam and Eve the fallen way that Satan looks at them. And so this creates a challenge for a Puritan reader as we go through the poem. This is the earliest illustration of Paradise Lost. I debated whether or not to show you guys this because it's a little dark and creepy, but we've got Satan here watching Adam and Eve, and in this illustration, basically Satan is masturbating as he watches Adam and Eve. He's grabbing his genitals. And so whoever illustrated the first edition of Paradise Lost got this. Now, there's a scholar, James Grantham Turner, he points out this is a little exaggerated, but Milton is definitely emphasizing Satan's perversity. He is a voyeur, he enters paradise, and he spends a substantial portion of the poem spying on Adam and Eve as they enjoy their marital bliss. And so this creates an uneasy situation because we are watching Satan as he watches Adam and Eve. And this raises the question, what differentiates our view of Adam and Eve from Satan's view? And so in Paradise Lost, we see what I would call demonic aesthetics. This is Satan's perverted response to beauty. Satan, like Laszlo Toth, enters into paradise. He sees incredible beauty, and rather than be awed by it, rather than be inspired by it, rather than being wooed back to holiness, he hates it. And much like Laszlo Toth, armed with his hammer, Satan strikes out at the beauty of Adam and Eve in order to destroy it. So let me go through and show you some of these sections where Milton deals very explicitly with the demonic aesthetics and how sin corrupts Satan's view. So Paradise Lost opens in the middle of the story. Long before Adam and Eve have appeared on the scene, the fallen angels have fallen into hell, and they wake up and they have exchanged the beauty of heaven for a sulfur pit. Everything stinks. Everything is dark. Everything is foul. And I always ask my students to think about this for a moment. Imagine if you had only known happiness and joy, and you wake up in this dungeon, and everything is hideous. Everything is disgusting. For the first, just imagine this. Imagine if you've never smelled anything bad your entire life. Never once. You've only smelled things that smell like roses, and suddenly you have the stench of the sulfur pits of hell. Imagine if you've never seen anything ugly, and now you have to look at this wasteland. This is what happens to the fallen angels when they wake up in hell, and they have to figure out how they got there, and more importantly, what they're going to do about it. And so in this beginning of Paradise Lost, Satan gives one of his most famous speeches in which he tries to encourage his fellow fallen angels that it's not that bad. And so this is, I believe, one of the greatest speeches in literature. I always tell my students that basically every inspirational movie speech you've ever heard is based on this speech right here. So here Satan is talking to the fallen angels, and he says, "Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal worlds. And thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, do and what I should be, all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free." Now, I want to point out something really interesting in this speech. Satan looks at the world around him, and he believes that he has exchanged this celestial glory for this infernal hell. But what he assumes has not changed is his own nature. Satan is physically fallen, but he does not believe in his own total depravity. He does not believe sin has corrupted his mind. He does not believe it's corrupted his will. He believes those are still free. And so, strangely, he doesn't see the environment around him as an indication that anything has changed in him. And so here Satan presents this idea, and the reason I think this is so inspirational, Milton knows it, this is why this is in every great speech, is Satan has to convince a group of people who are outnumbered, who have no chance of success, that they can still challenge. They can still challenge this cosmic authority. This is William Wallace in Braveheart. This is Maximus in Gladiator, trying to persuade a handful of men. This is Henry V, in Shakespeare's play. This is a general trying to lead a group of men on a suicide charge, right? But he does this by convincing them that even though their environment has changed, they have not. And so as long as they remain in control of themselves, as long as they remain themselves, they get to determine to some degree their own reality. They may not be able to change hell. They may not be able to make hell beautiful, but they can determine how they respond to it. I always tell my students, this is the basis of all cognitive behavioral therapy. If you go to a therapist who specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, they will tell you, you cannot control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. And so in that sense, you can determine your reality. You can redefine it. Something traumatic may have happened to you, but you can redefine it as a good thing. That's what Satan is saying here to the fallen angels. We have the ability to redefine our own reality. And this idea is in so many ways central to Western culture and how we think about selfhood. It's what makes it so tempting and what makes it so powerful. Now, I think implicit in this idea is that Satan is telling the fallen angels, even though hell is incredibly ugly, we can reinterpret it as beautiful. We can make it beautiful if we see it that way. And so for Satan, the will has the ability to redefine aesthetic reality. What is infernally ugly can become cosmically beautiful if you just view it that way. And so this is Satan's idea about how beauty works. So when Satan goes on his mission to paradise and he enters the Garden of Eden and he spies on Adam and Eve, he comes there to destroy them and to corrupt them. And this is where we see that Satan's idea of beauty, this idea that we determine our own realities, we define the nature of beauty, it's a subjective experience, is challenged. So this to me is the most remarkable scene in Paradise Lost. I usually spend a whole day talking about this with my students. It's utterly fascinating to me. So here in this scene, Eve is alone. She's working in the garden, and Satan sneaks up on her and takes on the guise of the serpent. And so he comes up to her and he begins to tempt, or he comes up to her with the intention of tempting her. But before he speaks to her, he is awed by her beauty. And Eve, of course, is the most beautiful thing in God's creation. So let's look at how Milton describes this interaction. And once again, keep in mind, we as the reader are kind of voyeuristically watching Satan watch Eve. And so we are very closely aligned with his perspective in this situation. So Milton tells us, such pleasure took the serpent to behold this flowery plat, the sweet recess of Eve, thus early, thus alone, her heavenly form angelic, but more soft, her every air of gesture or at least action overawed his malice, and with repine sweet bereaved his fierce intent it brought. That space the evil one abstracted stood from his own evil, and for a time remained stupidly good, of enmity disarmed, of guile, of hate, of envy, of revenge. Now, everybody, pay attention to this because this is so significant. Milton has two metaphors that he uses over and over again in Paradise Lost to describe the human condition: standing and falling, right? God says that Adam is made sufficient to stand. For Milton, to stand is to be upright, to be virtuous. It's to remain in your pre-lapsarian condition. To be fallen, on the other hand, obviously, is to be depraved, to have lost those qualities. This is the only time in Paradise Lost after the fall where Satan is described as standing. And what is it that allows him to stand? What is it that removes his sin, that makes him for a moment good again? It's beauty. Beauty is the most powerful force in the Miltonic cosmos. It does what nothing else can do. It makes the most evil person in the universe good again. So out of this scene, this is a interpretation that many scholars have had, that this is the Platonic ladder at work, that we see beauty, it draws us towards the divine, and we become good, or we become better. And so many scholars like Neil Forsyth and John Carey have argued that Satan still retains this capacity for goodness. And if God maybe would restore some of the benefits that he lost in heaven, he would be brought back to goodness. And so God, therefore, is at fault for Satan's evil. But I want to pay attention to what comes next here, because Milton, once again, as Milton has a habit of doing, he pulls the rug out from underneath us and makes us reinterpret what's happening here. So after Satan sees beauty, he's stupidly good. Stupid is, in the early modern English, would basically mean stupefied. Have you ever seen the movie Bambi? Do you all remember when Thumper is in the woods and the little bunny comes up and kisses him and he starts going like this, all right, and he turns all red? That's what it means to be stupefied, right? Your cognitive functions shut down. You become a just raw, sensory, stimuli response-driven person. And so what's interesting here is Satan does become good when he's exposed to beauty, but he only can be good when he's stupidly good. In other words, his brain has to be shut down in order for him to be good again. So now let's see what happens after this here. So after noting that Satan is good for a moment, the poet tells us, but the hot hell that always in him burns, though in mid-heaven soon ended his delight, and tortures him now more, the more he sees, of pleasure not for him ordained, then soon fierce hate he recollects, and all his thoughts of mischief gratulating thus excites. Thoughts, whither have ye led me, with what sweet compulsion thus transported to forget? What hither brought us, hate, not love, nor hope of paradise, for hell, hope here to taste of pleasure, but all pleasure to destroy, save what is in destroying. Other joys to me are lost. So in other words, what happens here, y'all, is Satan, much like Laszlo Toth, sees the beauty of Eve. He sees the most beautiful thing God has created. And rather than inspiring him to worship, it inspires him to destroy, because he wants to destroy something that reminds him of his own status as a created being who has been subjugated in the created order. He is not free. The mind is not its own place. It does not get to determine its own reality. And so what Satan does here is he forgets that he may be He is, the world around him is, when he's in hell, his environment is fallen, but what he forgets, as Milton puts it here, the hot hell that always in him burns. That state is never lost. And so wherever Satan goes, hell goes with him. And because of that, Satan is not capable of responding rightly to beauty. He does see beauty for what it is. He sees it as a reminder of the divine order. He sees it as a reminder of God's glory and God's grandeur. But rather than be excited to enjoy and worship that, it inspires this hatred. And so he has to destroy it. That is what he has to do. Now, my question is, if you're reading Paradise Lost and you're a Calvinist, if you're a Puritan in the 17th century, what does Paradise Lost do to you? What happens when you are aligned with Satan and you watch Satan have this failed and extreme response to beauty? You see him, like Laszlo Toth, reach out to destroy the beauty of God's creation. And so if you've read Paradise Lost, one of the things you know that people find perplexing is that Satan is oftentimes the most heroic character in the poem. William Blake said that Milton must have been of the devil's party, he just didn't know it, because Paradise Lost shows us a Satan who is very heroic, who's very sympathetic. And I think that's because Milton realizes, much like C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters, that when the devil tempts us, he always tempts us with his best arguments. He always tempts us with his best. And he gets us to confuse that with God's best. And so I think Paradise Lost creates a challenge because you as the reader are aligned with Satan, and your temptation is to look at the world and to respond to it the way he does, all right? And so one of the things I found in my study of the Puritans is the Puritans have many anxieties about imagination, because imagination, I don't know if you've ever reflected on the imagination, but we have this crazy ability to think about things that do not exist, to imagine things that are not real, and through that we have the option of conceiving a reality that is different than God's reality. This greatly vexed the Puritans. So Calvin said this about the imagination. He said, "The fallen imagination is a dreadful dungeon that imprisons humanity, since fallen men are inclined to follow the imagination of their heart rather than divine truth." He also says, "Our life cannot be properly formed except we renounce our imagination." William Perkins, who was one of the leading Calvinists in the late 1500s, said, "The imagination is only evil continually. rightly. John Bunyan, who of course wrote Pilgrim's Progress, even had this to say about the imagination. He says, the imagination is what inflames the soul with the desire to bring sin into act. We perceive or we imagine a sin, and then we're inflamed with the desire to bring it into reality. So if you were to go through a lot of the Puritan writings on the imagination, you would imagine that the Puritans would be horrified by what Milton is asking us to do. He's asking us to imagine paradise, but knowing that we can't do that. And so in the same way that Satan enters into the world of paradise and tries to corrupt Adam and Eve, we essentially corrupt the creation when we imagine a world and then we produce or fixate some fallen element of our own imagination into that world. Every time we imagine something in paradise that should not be in paradise, we are essentially sinning, according to the Puritans. So from a Puritan perspective, Paradise Lost seems to be a very dangerous book. But I think Milton knows this. So two scholars that I found very helpful, Charles Hambrick Stowe and William Durness, they note that even though the Puritans have all these seemingly negative things to say about the imagination, we need to remember that they're talking about the fallen imagination, not the sanctified imagination. And so it's through our fallen imaginations that we can imagine a world that exists independently and in defiance of God. But it's through our sanctified imagination that we can imagine a fallen world coming into harmony with God's reality. And so what Durness points out is that the Puritans often would emphasize this importance of inward reflection, and they would often emphasize when you read a text that you imagine yourself within the world of the story. You imagine yourself there with the characters, and so as you align with the characters, you get to see how they look, or you get to see how they act, and you get to decide whether they're acting rightly or wrongly. I think that's exactly what Paradise Lost does. It creates a litmus test of where you're at in your sanctification. It asks you to imagine this world, and it holds up Satan's response, and it asks you to compare how you respond to Adam and Eve, whether you imagine them in a pure, chaste way, or whether you imagine them like Satan does. Do we respond to beauty with a spirit of subjugation and reverence, or do we respond to it with defiance like Satan does? It's interesting, Milton originally intended Paradise Lost to be a play, but there's no way he could have performed this because of the problem of nudity in Renaissance audiences. They would have probably had to wear like robes, and it just would have looked weird and awkward. So he eventually turned it into a poem, but we actually have the drafts of the early play, and in the margins, Milton writes this phrase over and over again that I find very interesting. He says, cited to examination. And what I think he means by there is what his goal is as a reader is he wants you to examine something. And I think what he wants you to examine is yourself. I think Paradise Lost makes you very aware of how you are reading the poem. And it gets you to test how you read the poem, how you respond to beauty, how you respond to goodness, and you have the extreme version in Satan. And it allows you to compare what are the differences between how Satan responds and how you respond. So at the end of Paradise Lost, there's perhaps my favorite line in the entire poem where God is confronting Adam for his sin, and Adam turns to Satan, and he says something along the lines of, it's Eve's fault. She's so incredibly beautiful. When she brought me the forbidden fruit, I just had to go along with it. How could I not? She's so beautiful. And God, as I paraphrase it to my students, basically says, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize she was God. What he actually says is, was she thy God that thou her didst obey? Eve was adorned and lovely to attract, but her beauty is meant to inspire thy love, not thy subjection. For Milton, what corrupts us, what brings out our fallen nature, is not the object we worship or the object we contemplate, because we can be exposed to something that's incredibly sublime, something that's incredibly pure, something that's holy, and still have a fallen response. Much like Laszlo Toth smashing the Pietà with his hammer, much like Satan looking at Eve, you can put a fallen person in front of the best in the world, and they will still respond wrongly to it. And so it's not the object we contemplate, it's the way that we contemplate it. And so I think what Paradise Lost seeks to remind us over and over again is that, as Augustine says, the greatest temptation for human beings is to worship the creation rather than the creator, to turn goods into the best, to treat things that God meant to draw us to him as idols. And so over and over again, we see Satan do this, we see Adam and Eve do this, and so we as the reader are forced to navigate this and reflect on our own spiritual condition. Something that I think Milton and Calvin share here, this is a letter from John Calvin. He is writing to a Catholic theologian, and they're debating the effects of the Puritan, the Reformation. And so Calvin basically says here in this letter that Catholics tell Protestants, you've destroyed the true church. And Calvin reinverts this. He says, no, Catholics are the ones who have destroyed the true church. We're trying to take the severed parts of the church and build it back together the way it's supposed to be. Now, what I find remarkable in this letter, if you look here, he uses this metaphor of a pure, beautiful woman who has been sexually violated, mutilated by the Catholic Church. Right? This is the same kind of image that Shakespeare uses when we have Angelo lusting after Isabella, this trope of the beautiful woman who's threatened with sexual violence and destruction. And so Calvin associates here a hostility to truth with a hostility to beauty, specifically female beauty. And even though Milton and Calvin, according to most scholars, are totally opposed to each other in terms of their theology, Milton uses a strikingly similar metaphor here in his book Areopagitica, where he argues in defense of a free press. And so listen to what he says here about beauty. He has a wonderful analysis of the human condition that I think seems strikingly similar to Calvin's take. So what he says here is, truth indeed came once into the world with her divine master, and was a perfect shape, most glorious to look on. But when she ascended, and his apostles after him were laid asleep, then straight arose a wicked race of deceivers, who, as that story goes of the Egyptian Typhon with his conspirators, how they dealt with the god Osiris, took the virgin truth, hewed her lovely form into 1,000 pieces, and scattered them to the four winds. And from that time ever since, the sad friends of truth, I want to start a club someday called the Sad Friends of Truth, such as durst appear, imitating the careful search that Isis made for the mangled body of Osiris, went up and down, gathering up the limbs by limb as they still could find them. We have not yet found them all, lords and commons, nor ever shall do, till her master's second coming. But he shall bring together every joint and member, and shall mold them into an immortal feature of loveliness and perfection. So here, Milton uses the same metaphor that Calvin does, that a hostility to truth is also a hostility to beauty. And he uses this metaphor of this assault on the female body to encapsulate this idea. So who knows all the details of John Milton's theology? We can only speculate and argue. But when it came to the issue of sin and how sin affects our response to goodness and beauty, I think Calvin and Milton shared this belief that fallen people are in a labyrinth. And so sometimes we ignore beauty, sometimes we turn it into an idol and we worship the creation rather than the creator. But there are some of us who have an extreme hostility to beauty because we perceive it rightly, but it reminds us that we are creatures who have an obligation to worship the Creator. And in that case, like Satan, like Laszlo Toth, we have to destroy it because we cannot have any reminders that we are not, in fact, God. And writing in the context of the Reformation, I think Calvin and Milton share this strikingly similar vision of the human condition and how it affects our aesthetics. And I think that Milton grounds this in Paradise Lost because he wants you as the reader to think about, how do you respond to truth? How do you respond to beauty? Can you be tasked with holding and contemplating good things without corrupting them? And if you can't, then Milton wants to cite you to examination. He wants you to look at your heart and figure out what you need to do. And the question is whether or not you'll respond like Satan, like Toth, like Angelo from Measure for Measure, which incidentally is a play that Milton read many, many times and loved deeply, and whether you'll respond like those characters or you will respond in a sanctified way through the grace of God. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cole. Can you tell us how Blake and Shelley read Paradise Lost?
Very badly. The Romantics are fascinating because they love Milton deeply, but the reason they love Milton is because he's a rebel. And of course, Blake and Shelley see themselves as rebels who are trying to transform the world, and so they're greatly excited by Milton's political vision, and as well as his belief in the power of poetry and the role that poetry plays in changing society. But I don't think the Romantics understood Milton's theology. Of course, Blake believes Milton's totally sympathetic to the devil, and basically they view God as a symbol of tyrannical, really any kind of tyrant, anybody who enforces his will on others. And so even though Satan is doomed to failure, he's heroic because he has the audacity and the courage to stand up to that kind of tyrannical order. And the Romantics thought we needed more of that in our society. So I think Blake and Milton, Blake has that famous line, I'm trying to remember it, where he says, "Oh, we need another Milton. We need a poet like him walking the fields of England these days." So I think they move past Milton's theology and they view him entirely through a political lens.
Could we say their reading is a failed response to beauty?
I think we could. I think we definitely could. And this is to me the most helpful thing I've found in reading Paradise Lost is that when Satan says something about politics, if you interpret it through the lens of politics, he's speaking for Milton. If he says something theological, he's in total opposition to what Milton believes. So when Satan talks about the idea of a created order and the abuses of that order and how that hierarchy is detrimental and how it negates free will and the value of the individual, I think if you read that through a political lens, I do think Milton would have agreed with that because he was, after all, a rebel who argued for the execution of Charles I. But I think that's what makes Paradise so interesting is Milton takes his best ideas politically and puts them into the mouth of Satan. And so when politics spills over into theology and you get this emphasis on the individual being able to create their own reality apart from God, that's when the errors start to emerge.
Very good. Now, we look at the fallen angels and the way they think about things. They think of God as the great torturer and all this.
Yes.
Is he saying something about, can we take those angels to be just fallen man?
I think that Paradise Lost regularly invites us to think of the fallen angels as models for human responses to the world, and so I think it's very interesting in book 2 in book 1 when it says they reasoned high of fate and free will. They're essentially, the angels are acting like theologians. They're having a good conversation, but they don't go anywhere with it because they're trapped in that Calvinist labyrinth. So I think Milton is definitely, I think the angels are meant to be metaphors for the human condition. And I think at our most extreme, we risk being like them.
So I heard a theologian recently say, if you took the lid of hell off, nobody would come out. So the angels, they say, well, if we repent, we'll have to sing forced hallelujahs and we'd have to bow, and we don't want to do any of that. Is this another argument for the Calvinism of the poem, that if the angels are fallen men, there's zero interest in reconciling with God?
I think so, because arguably, if we go back to that idea of the Platonic ladder, that we're, in spite of our fallen condition, we're still basically good, and we're drawn to what's ultimately true and good and beautiful, exposure to beauty should lead Satan back to righteousness. And what C.S. Lewis, I think, very aptly points out in his preface to Paradise Lost is Satan gets increasingly less grand, and he starts off as a general, and by the end of the the end of the poem, he's described as like a toad crawling on his belly. And so he gets increasingly less grand. He gets more and more degraded as he goes along. So I think that's very consistent with that.
And that's what happens to the sinner that doesn't repent?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So going back to the DDC, De Doctrina Christiana, if Milton didn't write that, is there another option? Who would have written it?
This is a tough question. So De Doctrina, the front page of De Doctrina Christiana starts off with a handwritten note that this is written in emulation of all these theologians that whoever the writer is admired. And most of them are either European Protestant reformers who are deeply Calvinist or English Puritans. And so it seems very strange to say, I'm going to write this book in honor of these people who inspired me, and then to write a book that's deeply heretical. So from the very first page, DDC goes in weird directions. So it is possible that some of those are Milton's chapters and then they were spliced together with other writings. It's possible that this is a writing of maybe a younger Milton before he became grounded in his Calvinism. It's possible that his secretary wrote it and it's a reflection of his theology. Or it is possible, as many scholars have argued, that Milton did write DDC and it's a reflection of his mature theology. But at the end of the day, he still retains some very Calvinist ideas. And it's not. I definitely think Catherine Gemelli Martin is wrong that you can't read. She says you can't read Paradise Lost without being offended by it if you're a Calvinist. And I have yet to have a Calvinist student be offended by Paradise Lost. So I think she's wrong about that.
But you do get offended at the footnotes, right?
Exactly.
They'll say we know he's anti-Trinitarian, therefore read it this way.
Yes.
You tell your students just ignore those footnotes, right?
The footnotes often lead to despair.
Okay. We'll see. So DDC, then don't read it into Paradise Lost. Lewis says Milton's trying to write the great Christian epic. So even if he is, like you said, if it is his, It's not there in Paradise Lost necessarily, but all the critics want to read it in. They want to footnote, oh, DDC says this, read it into all these different scenes in Paradise Lost.
My own take, I think what we need to remember is that our theology, or lack thereof, definitely shapes our approach to scholarship. And this is one of those things that, of course, you can never get most people to fess up to in the midst of an argument. But I think for secular critics, Milton is a very polemical writer. He's got a long, long line of polemics on various topics. And I think there's this hesitancy to claim him as a Christian writer if all he's doing is preaching an orthodox Christian message. That makes him, simply stated, that makes him boring to a lot of secular critics. So a heretical, heterodox Milton is very edgy. It makes him much more interesting. And so I think there's definitely a theological prejudice there that Milton can't have any value if his theology is just within. It's essentially taking Blake's idea that he's of the devil's party. We now know Milton, no one would say that today with a few exceptions, but they would say Milton is, heretical in his theology. So he's of a different party that makes him more interesting for a lot of critics.
As if what he's doing is not controversial in itself.
Exactly.
What makes you, so you made a good defense of the poem. What makes you uneasy about it, even granting, let's say it isn't heretical? I mean, he's taking the Bible story and reshaping it and adding things to it. Does that make you uneasy at all?
That's a question I often get from students, like what are the ethics of re-envisioning creation? And I've definitely had one student who argued that Milton is inspired, so whatever he says is biblical. That was a strange one. I'm honestly not vexed by that. I think what Milton realizes is that when we read the Bible, we all imagine the story. We all create the world of the story within our imaginations. And so every time we read the Bible, we are all essentially creating our own version of it. The question is whether it's accurate or not. So I've never been greatly vexed by the ethics of that. I do admit I am the view of the Trinity I do find strange. I think that there is reason, I think, to question whether or not Milton believes in a orthodox view of the Trinity, but also Satan's whole argument throughout the poem is that the Son, Jesus, is created by God, and so therefore God has messed up the order of things. And so key to Satan's rebellion is the idea that the Trinity, or there is no Trinity, the Son is created, and so therefore God has disturbed the hierarchy of how things are supposed to be. And so once again with Paradise Lost, we're so often looking at things through Satan's lens. And so the question to me becomes whether Milton is saying the Trinity is not real, or Satan is saying the Trinity is not real. I think that's a interpretive dilemma.
Doesn't Abdiel push back on that?
I remember he does. Abdiel's my favorite character. I would love to name a child Abdiel, but I think it would be torture for kids. So Abdiel, if you haven't read Paradise Lost, Abdiel has the best line in Paradise Lost besides God's rebuke to Adam, where Satan gives this really great speech about freedom and individuality, and it's very inspirational. It's the heart of, I have a feeling the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, had read Paradise Lost, and I would gather Thomas Jefferson liked Satan. But Abdiel just sits there and listens to this speech, and he says, "You are to your own self enthralled." Enthralled is a word that means enslaved, and I think about that all the time. I think I've definitely said that in a couple of online debates with people. So it's a great winning line if you ever need to use it.
Okay, I know there's questions from all of you. I asked Jude if he'd come up and do the microphone for me. There he is.
So there's a scene in Book 2 of Paradise Lost where during the consultation I think it's the demon Mammon, who suggests that instead of openly waging war on heaven, they should rather stay in the pit of hell and make the most of where they are and use what they have to make hell more livable. And he even goes so far as to say that it would be with the intention of mimicking the heavenly beauty. So with your discussion of demonic aesthetics and whatnot, what do you make of that suggestion, given that they're using heaven as the aesthetic standard?
So that makes me think of Augustine's observation that those who set themselves up against God can only perversely imitate him, because the devil doesn't get to create any new materials. He can only repurpose them. So the fallen angels, as part of their demonic aesthetics, they don't have the ability to create a new world, but they can repurpose hell, so to speak. At least they think they can. And so, but that all depends on Satan's claim that the mind is its own place. It's not affected by any other kind of reality. And so Satan sees the mind as autonomous, free, uninfluenced by environment. But of course, the epic poet tells us that's definitely not the case. So the idea that you can repurpose hell into something satisfactory that will only last for so long. As we see with Satan, eventually reality comes in and dashes your illusions.
I'm curious what you'd make of the criticism that as a fallen person, Milton's trying to create unfallen characters, and I guess this might be more of a Blake or Shelley view, that all the characters that are unfallen end up being very flat and kind of boring, because trying to even imagine what perfect people would say is outside of our ability to create, whereas Satan is a fallen being, and we can relate more, so he's more dynamic. What would you say to that criticism?
I would agree. I think God as a character is very flat. Satan is very dynamic. I had a friend. He used a computer algorithm to go through and evaluate Satan's speeches and compare them to other speeches throughout literature. And Satan undoubtedly has the most heroic speeches, and they're very similar to the speeches you might find in the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, things like that. But I think C.S. Lewis has the observation that we all know how to play the devil because it's the part that's most familiar to us, and it's very hard to play a good man. Some of that, I think, is our own limited ability to imagine goodness that's as exciting as sin. But I also think, again, Milton wants you to enter into the poem imaginatively. He wants you to identify with Satan in hopes that by the time you get to the end of the poem, you will reject that alignment. There's terms in film theory that I find very helpful. Alignment is when you look at things the way the character looks at things, and that may or may not lead to sympathy. And sympathy is where you actually become in agreement with the character. And so I think Milton aligns us with Satan. He makes Satan very interesting and appealing, but I think at the end of the poem, he wants us to break off and part ways.
You talked about how Paradise Lost is a litmus test for our own faith and sanctification, and how do we see things like Satan the way that Satan does, or can we fight that? Is this the sort of thing junior high and high school students should be reading with such heavy themes and high stakes? And I understand that this is kind of a question about censorship, so if you don't want to open that can of worms, that makes sense. But how do we as Christians know we're ready, or our children are ready to do this kind of a reading of Paradise Lost and then of reality?
That is a great question. So Milton obviously, had many, many things to say about the evils of censorship as he understood it. But I can't imagine teaching Paradise Lost to high school students. At least most of the high school students I've interacted with. I think it would be hard for them to grasp. I actually don't even teach this in my sophomore level class. I wait to my upper division classes to teach Paradise Lost. As far as the dangers of this, I think what's interesting is this poem challenges your expectations, because when you read the poem, Satan shows up and you think, oh, it's Satan. He's the bad guy. And then he gets a few speeches in, and you go, oh, that's kind of inspirational. That makes sense to me. And I think Milton, he has a great line in Areopagitica. He says, I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue that never sallies out to meet its foe. And he says that virtue is an excremental whiteness. And so for Milton, virtue doesn't have any claim to virtue unless it goes out and challenges and overcomes. The question, I think, to your point would be that just requires discernment on the part of teachers and the parts of parents, figuring out what challenges children and teenagers and college students are ready to face. But at some point, virtue has to go out and face a challenge. And for Milton, the beauty of literature is it allows you to enter into imaginatively into these worlds before you go out there and face those issues in the real world. It's essentially a flight simulator that prepares you before you step into the real cockpit.